but in less than 1 second. These are not seconds, less than 1 second.
Jurisdiction on a campus in Mr. Charlie's physical proximity. And they were coordinating with local PD and campus PD to make sure all of those venues. But
also
ultimately,
we don't have counter snipers. We don't have the Secret Service.
Right. Well, exactly. But in many
This is the brief on the security and transparency concerns surrounding a recent Charlie Kirk event. So let's get into what happened. We're looking at a major public gathering organized by TPUSA. That's Charlie Kirk's conservative student group. And it's really highlighted some critical lessons about event safety and accountability. First, a security veteran named Brian Harple is raising some serious red flags. He pointed out what he calls a failure in basic verification. The security team apparently just took someone's word that rooftops were being monitored. They didn't actually confirm if local police or their own people were up there. Second, the logistics were a total nightmare. Get this, attendance ballooned to over 3,000 people. That's 5 times the original estimate of 600. When you combine that with an open access event, well, trying to manage the crowd and assess any threats becomes incredibly difficult. And finally, here's the real kicker. On top of all the security issues, there are reports of missing or incomplete surveillance footage. Now, this is pretty ironic, considering Charlie Kirk has built his brand on demanding full transparency from institutions. You know, like calling for the release of the Epstein files. It's a stark reminder that demanding public transparency really requires you to be transparent yourself, especially when safety is at stake.
Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're looking at a really critical friction point that comes up when high-stakes political advocacy meets, well, real-world execution. We're focusing on a major public figure who's known for this relentless demand for systemic transparency and accountability from powerful institutions.
Right, from government agencies, the Department of Justice, demanding the release of the Epstein files, things like that.
Exactly. And the friction here comes from these detailed reports, particularly from law enforcement veteran Brian Harple, which seem to reveal some pretty significant operational gaps in the security and management of this figure's recent public event. We're talking failures in security verification, crowd control, coordination with local authorities.
So that brings us to the core of it.
Our central question is this. Do these demonstrable internal failures of, let's say, meticulous planning and verification, do they undermine the credibility and the moral efficacy of that figure's public advocacy for broad systemic transparency? I'm going to argue that yes, the failure to meet these rigorous standards of diligence, especially on safety, it significantly weakens the moral authority you need for that kind of critique.
Okay, that's a powerful way to frame it. But I have to push back on that premise. I'm going to argue that while, yes, these operational shortcomings are serious, they absolutely have to be addressed. They don't negate the objective validity or the crucial importance of the advocacy itself. The principles he champions stand on their own, separate from the logistical challenges of one event.
Well, let's ground this right away in performance. I mean, if accountability is the measure, then performance has to be verified. And the reports point to multiple instances where verification, it just failed. Take the protective planning for rooftop coverage. The reports say personnel were promised, but, verification didn't happen. Harple himself called that a critical oversight. When you advocate for total transparency, for an assume nothing, verify everything standard for federal agencies, you have to apply that same rigorous standard to your own protective sphere. Security 101 demands proactive confirmation, not just relying on someone saying, oh, it's all sorted, don't worry about it. This lapse in fundamental verification. It suggests a real gap between the accountability you demand from others and the rigor you apply to yourself.
Okay.
And beyond that, we can't ignore the catastrophic failure in just basic crowd management. The organizer planned for 600 attendees, but the actual crowd was over 3,000. That's a 500% miscalculation. For an open access event, that kind of failure in crowd monitoring and access control, it isn't a minor error. It's a total loss of control over the event's parameters, and it just instantly escalates the risk to an unacceptable level. So my point is, if you demand meticulousness from these huge institutions, you have to show that same rigor internally, especially when safety's on the line.
I'm sorry. I
I don't buy that logistical event failures fundamentally invalidate a systemic, intellectual argument against institutional opacity. I think we really have to distinguish between an operational mistake and a philosophical contradiction.
But are they really separate in this case?
I think so. Look, I acknowledge the security failures are serious. The staffing gaps, the lack of verification, all of it. But these are issues inherent to the incredibly complex execution of a large-scale event, which, by the way, was handled by a third-party organizer, TPUSA. And the context matters. The source material is very clear. These organizers are not the Secret Service. They lack the advanced equipment, snipers, drone programs, deep jurisdictional authority that the state agencies this figure critiques have at their disposal. They have to rely on coordination with local police, campus authorities, who might not always be perfectly aligned. The advocacy he's pursuing, challenging these powerful institutions, arguing for the public's right to verified information, it operates on a completely different plane than coordinating event security. Security is just inherently vulnerable to human error, to logistical overruns, especially when you're hit with a massive, unexpected surge in people. The objective need for institutional transparency, that remains true, regardless of how well an organizer manages a crowd 5 times bigger than they planned for.
I see why you want to draw that line between operational negligence and philosophical integrity. But for me, that distinction feels deeply unsatisfying when we're talking about high-stakes public advocacy. The source material explicitly calls the lack of verification on rooftop police coverage a critical oversight. When the figure's entire platform is built on exposing negligence and demanding proof, that internal oversight fundamentally undermines the very principle of diligence he's breaching.
But is it undermining the principle or just the perception of it?
I'd say both. My point isn't that he's philosophically wrong about the need for transparency. It's about perceived competence, which is really the currency of credibility. Think of it this way. If a surgeon demands every tool be sterile, but then fails to check his own gloves before operating, his demands are instantly hollowed out. The general principle of sterile surgery is still valid, of course, but his authority to enforce it is gone. You have to enact that principle in your immediate sphere of control before you can demand it from the world.
That's an interesting analogy, but let me challenge the premise that operational negligence is the same as systemic deceit. When the security team failed to fully liaise with local authorities about who was stationed where, that was an operational mistake in coordination, a failure of execution, maybe born out of rushing or miscommunication. The systemic critique he's making, on the other hand, is aimed at intentional institutional withholding of information, data that's protected for political gain or hidden behind opaque legal and procedural reasons that just shield power and create distrust. We're talking about 2 vastly different kinds of opacity. One is accidental, a logistical mess-up in a high-stress scenario. The other is a deliberate, structural suppression of public records. Equating the 2 really diminishes the severity of the corruption he's trying to expose.
But if the systemic failure he's pointing to is based on the lack of rigor, then his own operational failure reflects poorly on his commitment to that same rigor. Let's just focus on the staggering scale of that miscalculation again, expecting 600 people and getting over 3,000. This isn't a rounding error. This extreme failure in crowd monitoring and access control meant they lost accountability, making it, and this is a quote, difficult to identify potential threats. So how can you credibly lead the charge for rigorous, accountable standards across society when the most basic measure of safety, crowd management, is missed by 500%? Credibility demands consistency.
Okay, and I see why you're hammering that 500% surge. And I'll grant you, it represents an extreme logistical failure. But let me offer a different perspective that's rooted in the environment of this kind of advocacy. The source material notes that high-profile figures who actively question powerful institutions, they naturally attract unpredictable and massive audiences. The challenge here is the open access nature of the event combined with frankly, the capacity constraints of the organization. The organizers themselves pointed out their limitations. They don't have the sophisticated tools of state agencies. The challenge of adjusting protocols on the fly for a 5-fold surge, that just highlights the unique vulnerability of private security teams. Are you saying that if an advocacy group lacks the resources of the FBI, they forfeit the right to demand that the FBI be transparent? This is an argument about being under-resourced, not about being intellectually dishonest.
I'll grant your point on capacity constraints. But that constraint then becomes its own argument for why private groups can't manage this level of risk while also demanding perfect accountability from the state. So let me push this a little. Where do you draw the line philosophically? If that failure in crowd monitoring led, tragically, to a serious injury or a fatality because they couldn't identify a threat, would you still claim the systemic principles stand entirely independently of that operational consequence?
That's a necessary, if uncomfortable, hypothetical. A fatality caused by negligence would demand a full investigation, massive consequences for the organizers, absolutely. But even in that dire scenario, the principle that government should release verified public records about systemic injustice remains objectively true. The integrity of the argument for releasing the Epstein files does not hinge on the competence of one private security team. The validity of truth claims has to be separate from the performance of the messenger. The operational failure would be a profound crisis, yes, but not a contradiction of the core transparency mission.
Conceptual clarity is important, but so is rhetorical effectiveness. And let's move on to information control itself, because this is where the operational failure really starts to mirror the systemic critique. Reports indicate there's missing or incomplete surveillance footage from the event. This directly fuels the exact kind of speculation and distrust that the figure himself is constantly fighting against. He always says full disclosure is necessary for accountability. Now, even if law enforcement is withholding that footage for procedural reasons, the resulting opacity around a critical security event mirrors the very problem he criticizes. It creates an unavoidable credibility challenge. When you champion full transparency, you simply cannot afford to have opacity, accidental, procedural, whatever, in your own orbit.
That's a compelling point, because optics are crucial. But have we considered the professional distinction between procedural withholding and a systemic cover-up? The reporting noted it's not unusual for official security footage to be withheld for legal reasons during an ongoing investigation, especially when law enforcement has taken control of the scene. It's a standard temporary measure to secure the chain of custody for evidence. The figure's critique is aimed at demanding verified public records, often about decades-long institutional patterns. A temporary procedural delay for an active investigation is just. It's conceptually and practically separate from the active systemic suppression of public records that he advocates against. We have to be careful not to confuse due process with a cover-up.
And yet, that temporary delay, that procedural opacity, is exactly what the opposition seizes on to weaken the core message. The power of his advocacy is rooted in the perceived moral high ground of rigorous accountability. When issues like the failure of verification, the lapse in crowd monitoring, and now this ambiguity around missing footage all come up, that perceived rigor it evaporates. It forces a reasonable person to ask, if this organization can't manage the basic fundamentals of safety and information control at its own event, how effective can they be in demanding vast systemic change from powerful government bodies? The internal negligence provides the perfect rhetorical ammunition to dismiss the external charge.
And I would counter that while these operational failures provide easy ammunition for opponents, the importance of the principles, the necessity of transparency, the public's right to know, are so foundational to a democracy that they can't be erased by the failings of a security subcontractor. If we let a localized logistical failure invalidate a systemic critique, we just grant powerful institutions an easy out. They can just point to the organizational challenges of their critics, instead of addressing the substance of the critique itself. We have to prioritize the objective truth of that critique over a localized operational challenge that really stems from an under-resourced team facing massive public interest.
For me, this debate confirms that the effectiveness of advocacy rests not just on the validity of the claims, but crucially on the perceived rigor and consistency applied internally. The evidence of failures in verification, crowd monitoring, and coordination, it demonstrates critical lapses in diligence. And when you pair those with a platform demanding full disclosure, it creates a deeply damaging tension around credibility. The credibility gap here feels entirely self-inflicted.
And I maintain that while this event is a crucial, maybe painful, case study in the need for meticulous planning. The logistical failure of a private security team operating under capacity does not negate the objective need for transparency in government. The systemic issues he's raising about government opacity and accountability, they remain universally relevant, regardless of the challenges faced during one single, very complex public gathering.
What this material ultimately highlights, I think, is that these high-profile public events always intersect with broader critical questions of safety, communication, and public trust.
Absolutely. And they offer incredibly valuable lessons for policymakers, event organizers, and security professionals on the non-negotiable need for proactive verification and robust contingency planning.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.